Greetings for the last time, Cinema Appreciation class. I hope you are doing fantastically well. As our class comes to a close and we reminisce about some of the films that we've seen, read, studied, this is actually our class that deals with the 100 most influential films of all time. As we've talked about numerous times, there are four main ways that we evaluate the great aspects of film and what are the most influential films. They're listed right over here. The greatest accomplishments in film industry, they have to do with the idea of the aesthetics, the number of awards, how well they've actually put the entire construction together. A film's impact on society. So has it impacted us and changed our behavior, the way we think, the way we feel, such as the Psycho scene where individuals literally look behind the curtain before taking a shower. Any technological advances that may have happened in the film or new innovations, whether that's the development of low-key lighting, whether that's the development of the idea of looking at the dolly zoom from Hitchcock. And finally, film as a business, commercial success. And we have to take that in consideration in your arguments when we talk about film as commercial success. We have to adjust for inflation because it's not fair if a movie such as Gone with the Wind costs 25 cents to go see it in our day, and today it takes $10 or $12 to go see a movie or video rental for $1.99. We've got to adjust for that aspect for inflation so people can see and talk about films equally. And then it's up to you whether you consider all the commercial success that goes along with it. Do you want to count t-shirt sales, which are different in the modern day world, or Disney variations, for example, in Beauty and the Beast, which was made on Broadway, or The Lion King, one of the most successful Broadway shows of all time. And note, as we come through and look at this, as you'll see from my disclaimer, that's why sometimes I'll get hate mail or people are like, this is one of the worst lists ever into the top 100. Many of those comments will be common if they didn't read this and make sense. And here's the issue. This is not a list. I'm very aware. This is not a list of the 100 greatest films of all time as created by the American Film Institute or any of the other things. It's not about the greatest. It's about influence to explain film for an introductory art or cinema appreciation class. In fact, every semester my film classes evaluate which films to eliminate from the list and which films to add. Recent eliminations have been 12 Years a Slave and the Lego Movie, and recent additions are Lawrence of Arabia and Akira. Some years my class is going to get it better than other years. But the entire goal is this is an ongoing dialogue between a class from the past and a class from the present. And note, the whole idea as we want to do this is it has to be objective. We're not making the argument that I like it, it felt more to me. Is it one of the greatest accomplishments in film industry? What is the impact on society? Does it have technological advances in film or in filmmaking? And what about the business side? If a film hits all four and you really have good arguments for all four, it's going to be almost impossible to take it off the list as part of your final exam. Remember, your final exam is to take these or 10 of these films off and make an argument for why they come off, and take 10 new films and put them on the list and argue why they belong on the film, or why they all belong in the top 100 most influential for cinema appreciation. So think about that as we go, not just throughout the semester if you're watching this early on, but specifically also at the end of the semester as making it harder for the next semester for the next students in cinema appreciation. Luckily, the film industry still makes 1,200 films a year, so there's always going to be new additions that come up. And let's begin our list. Now, as we begin the list, there are no particular order, roughly, and so you can organize them however you would like. But number one, I put down as Citizen Kane, one of the greatest films of all time. We talked about all the first. This really does invent the idea of modern day cinematic kind of genius in terms of the Hollywood model, the low-key lighting. Talked about the dramatic variations of the story, the chapter heading that later on Quentin Tarantino is going to use, the idea of off sound impacting the sound both before and after a scene when J and L cuts. It is a spectacular achievement in filmmaking by a first-time director, Orson Welles, at 24 years of age. It also challenges even the way that we construct film in the modern day world in terms of a marketing, research, the idea of the creation of the film, and then the distribution of the film. This film challenges all of that. Number two, Birth of a Nation, the milestone, even though it's one of the most racist films of all time. The idea of the creation here by D.W. Griffith, one of our early film production kind of geniuses, challenging and creating everything from classical cutting, the 180-degree rule, the eye line match we've talked about, the close-ups for an emotional impact, cutting on movement and thematic editing across two stories that converge in terms of the chase scene that happens later on, also sometimes referred to as parallel editing or cross-cutting, the title cards, the cutting to continuity. This is the basis of what we look at Hollywood for storytelling that shows up all the way back in 1915. Trip to the Moon, as we talked about many times before, the birth of science fiction and of special effects. One of the most important films of all time, even though it's a short runtime of only 13 minutes. The coloration of the individual scenes to provide color and look at how that aspect works as well. And just kind of inventing a new way of looking at film. Early on, thought of as a formalist film, and now we would put this more in the classical style because it challenged all the rules of earlier realism. The lovely film Battleship Potemkin, challenging the Hollywood way of making film in a Russian model, which really the basis of montage theory, going all the way back to the idea of Pudovkin. Montage is such a powerful image now from the French word to assemble, and this is really where it first gains its first major hold. The Odessa Steps sequence, one of the most famous in all of history, literally showing the baby carriage falling down, which we're later going to reference in the Untouchables. The idea of purity in the face of some evil that's before it, and really uses a Soviet propaganda piece, challenging the narrative structure of Birth of a Nation. And literally, today's modern day films kind of combine both elements. We really can thank the French New Wave for combining those and challenging other rules in the future. Metropolis, the hallmark image of early science fiction. While Voyage to the Moon or Trip to the Moon sets the stage of what science fiction is, this codifies everything, giving us the idea of the dystopian universe that later on we're going to see in Divergent, The Hunger Games, Star Wars. The idea of the cyborg robot as a major character, machines starting to rule over our society, the special effects used to show the motion on large scale events, even though that's small scale. Sometimes the setting is that's smaller than the set before you. The optical illusions and tricks that show up here that can actually put me in place and having a drink at the Star Wars cantina. I'm just waiting for Chewie to show up so we can shoot the breeze for a little while. That's what we're looking at with Fritz Lang and Metropolis. We also have the idea of the upper class and the lower class living completely separate lives in this capitalist kind of dystopian universe, which we absolutely see. Don't forget the mad scientist. My favorite movie of all time, the movie that I grew up on, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. Just for a game changer in terms of science fiction. Actually, in this case, the verge of science fiction and fantasy, and we will refer to this movie as a fantasy movie because the science, while there is some elements of it, is so fantastical and over the top, even by today's standards. This really does give us the idea of the fantasy world. A brilliant introduction, a new introduction for the exposition that shows up in kind of the Freitag, the idea of the commercial marketing, the idea of multiple sequels coming out of it, the idea of the cultural ramifications, which are enormous for future films, the idea of promoting the blockbuster film that's going to come out in the summer, which literally Steven Spielberg had a hand in here and invents in the movie Jaws. It is an overwhelming experience. And still, even to this day, the most valuable movie franchise on the planet, with Marvel's MCU quickly catching up. But currently, the value of this franchise is more than $70 billion, with Marvel's Avengers somewhere in the 58 range. The arrival of a train, the establishment of the realist kind of film, and the true realist film with no editing, no cutting, sets the standard for what potentially documentary film can and can't be, even though it's a short 1 minute long. It is a brilliant look at the use of camera to document real life events that's taking place and really establishes the Lumiere brothers as at the forefront of filmmaking as an art form, but also as a documentary process. 1914's Gertie the Dinosaur. Brilliant animation. It's one of our first animation, got the lovable character, so much so that later on in Disney, if you go to Hollywood Studios, they have Gertie the Dinosaur ice cream stand. So even Walt Disney was paying homage to kind of the founder, who's considered, in this individual here, Winsor McCay, who is generally considered the father of animation. So he is the person who starts off an entire new genre of animation in Gertie. Number 9, one of the most beloved movies of all time, constantly being ripped and spoofed in many capacities. We have Broadway plays and musicals coming out of this, but before, the after, the idea of how did the witches get the way they were. We go back and we look at Broadway musicals of Wicked. We have The Wiz, just deals with an African American kind of hip hop culture aspect of The Wizard of Oz. There's multiple songs that reference it. I will get you my pretty lines that everyone knows. There's no place like home. Ruby Red Slipper is probably the most important piece of film culture ever. So much so that they're actually in the Smithsonian Institute, right near Archie Bunker's chair from television. And the idea here is the creation of a completely fantastical world with very bright colors, the introduction of color in a main screen image that is actually not based upon animation or hand coloration, but actually incorporated within the plot and the idea here. The idea of the costumes, the makeup, the setting, all of these set the standard for people to actually do big budget films based upon these lovely individuals. And it was so far in advance that people were not even ready for the fantastical world. This basically introduces us into fantasy. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first commercially successful animated full-length feature by Disney, sets the standard, creates the idea of the good versus evil, creates the Disney kind of logos, mythos that shows up in the aftermath of Steamboat Willie of what an animated feature can do. It's also Disneyfied because it comes out of German's Romance languages, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, with terrible endings. So we're going to make happy endings for children rather than scare tactics to try to get children to behave. On top of all of this, it's the first time we have really a full cast of animators that are doing story and developing. It's the popularization of their cell cartoon, which literally is going to go on for the better part of 50 years along with stop motion here. It does set the standard of what great animated filmmaking can be. Seven Samurai, what an amazing feature by Akira Kurosawa. So this is the hallmark of Japanese classical cinema coming out from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. One of the spectacular artists. What is amazing about Kurosawa is all the inventions. So the Seven Samurai, think about them as superhero movies today, where you have the superhero team coming together to take over with a reluctant hero, and hero that's a little bit on the outside that might rise to be the superhero. Individuals coming together. Later on, this is going to become our spaghetti western as well, which so influences American culture, and even thinking about American Wild West culture comes out of the Seven Samurai, and actually the influence that it shows up. That specifically on the Magnificent Seven. There's a reason the seven are used. There's seven cowboys versus the samurai. It's fantastic. One of the best directors that's ever lived. The Jazz Singer, 1927. This is one of the first films that actually has synchronized sound called the talkies. Rather than having a score, which you actually read, or live musical instrument, this is actually a talkie and a fantastic film, but specifically for its technical innovation. Number 13, a challenging film, Nanook of the North, because we have to run into the question and start asking the questions about what a documentary film is. This is a silent film with a background score where Nanook, who became a superstar celebrity, who was an individual of the Inuit, we used to call them Eskimos, living in the Arctic Circle. He was asked to reenact what his family heritage had done 50 to 100 years beforehand, before they had more of the modern technology, because it was a culture that was being lost. So it was a way of documenting the culture. So the director here, Robert Flaherty, is considered the founder of documentary film, though it is a romanticized documentary film. Where would we be in animation without Steamboat Willie? Thank you, Walt Disney. We're looking at a very short, 8-minute long individual that introduced us to Mickey Mouse. Now, this is not the first Mickey Mouse cartoon. This is the third Mickey Mouse cartoon, but it was the first cartoon to have synchronized sound specifically because of thanks to the early release of a jazz singer, which we already talked about, the innovation of synchronized sound. It also introduces to this kind of cutesy culture and the ability of what animation is able to make us really fall in love with different characters, the same way we would do it on an emotional viewpoint. It takes what Gertie the Dinosaur by Winsor McKay had done earlier as the father of animation and puts it to that next new level. It is this film, ultimately, along with Snow White, that established animation as a real, not just career, but as a dominant film genre. Probably the most trying, difficult film on this entire list. This is Triumph of the Will. This is by a fantastic female director, which we don't have too many female directors on the list, which you can always address by changing this 100 list at the end of the term. This is by Leni Riefenstahl, fantastic director, documentary director. She was giving, excuse me, carte blanche. And Triumph of Will is a documentary film, but it is also a propaganda film. And the problem is, are the two synonymous? All the footage that you see was set up, was created, was probably going to happen almost in the exact same way as it was going to happen. Leni helped frame, the director, Leni Riefenstahl, helped guide the action, the motion, so she could get all the different angles, but they are actually at live events. And then basically intercut different scenes to show you the reaction versus Hitler. And kind of the promotion of Hitler and the Nazi party, the Third Reich, as this dominant force, basically there for the positive good of all Germans that show up. If you've ever seen other footage of Nazi Hitler, Hitler and the Nazis, whether that was from Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade or Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, going back to Brad Pitt film that actually talked about before, where he actually infiltrates the Nazis and actually runs in and has a chance to talk to Hitler. It all comes from the documentary stock that became this film, Triumph of the Will. Leni Riefenstahl, no surprise, was blacklisted afterwards. She made a film that actually promotes Hitler and, of course, gets associated with all those negativities. And the question we have to ask is that fair? The director is doing that, being paid to do a particular project. Is it fair to actually say that she or he, in this capacity, would be responsible for the imagery that comes out in terms of promotion for whatever the terrible action an individual did later on? Number 16, Breathless, by Godard, Jean-Luc Godard, one of the French New Wave, challenging the idea of Italian neorealism in the very dark, formulaic way that Hollywood had been shot up beforehand. And so shot, reverse shot, angle, camera editing, they're basically breaking all the rules. Godard, as long as other directors like Truffaut, they are known for kind of breaking the rules. And this is what Quentin Tarantino loves so much about what they are doing within this process. And so it's a fantastic aspect. It really does deal with some impulsivity issues that take place for some of a motorcycle policeman. And so it deals with the kind of the French new culture that was developed in the 1950s and the celebration, but also fear of what may go wrong within that new culture, but in a very positive aspect in terms of showing you new ways of looking at classical cutting. They actually start to break the rules. Also very famous for its discontinuity ending. So rather than just showing someone head on, they showed someone head on, someone head on, and it will just break the conversation. So you're conscious that you're watching a film. Seventh Seal, which we actually watched the scene and talked a little bit about, particularly under the idea of kinetics. Kinetics are this entire idea where you have to know the difference between stasis and something that's moving. So even in the most action film, we need to have some time to rest, to take a breath, to reflect. Because if it's action, 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 we actually don't have that ability to be involved with the character. We need those restful moments. And so this is a film that's mostly restful moments. So we need that kinetic. Here's an individual that is playing on a very philosophical level, is bargaining and trying to play chess against death, knowing that he's going to die at the end. So he takes his time within the process, right? He knows these are his last moments on Earth. He reflects back and tells stories about his earlier aspect of life, a deeply religious kind of experience and very philosophical, which is what a lot of European and international films are known for. Very slow paced by our modern day standards. A lot of our modern day films will have 2,000 shots in it. Seven Seal has about 1,000, actually even a little under 1,000. So Us versus Death. Charlie Chaplin, the birth of comedy. Modern times, generally considered his most famous and best work, along with The Great Dictator, which I'm not sure if it appears on our list, which is a spoof of Hitler, and kind of Nazi Germany and how we need to get involved. Modern times, he basically takes on the idea of what happens if we get involved in a highly mechanical world where the mechanical world is actually more important than human individuals, even in terms of kind of the lunch feeding machine where it's constantly feeding him and making mistakes. And he's got to be forced to, eat nuts and bolts and spit them out on the cord machine that goes crazy. Later on, he's going to invent the character the Tramp. And at this time in modern times, he is the world's superstar. There is no one that even touches him. So imagine the most famous 5 people in the world, put them all together, and they're probably still not as big as Charlie Chaplin. So take the biggest soccer player in the world, no matter what generation it is, arguably over time, it's got to be Pele, right? The greatest soccer player, the player that everyone wants to emulate and be like over time. Take that with Beyonce, Queen Bee today. Take that with the popularity of Michael Jackson from the 1980s and 1990s, where he was the father of pop and everything. Add that a little sprinkling of the Beatles and their celebrity culture, because this is all before celebrity culture. He was it. So much so that when he showed up in New York City for his first tour of the United States, he's from England, they actually shut down the school so school children could bring their families to go catch a glimpse of this individual that never even had talked on camera up until then. Fantasia, taking animation with Disney to an absolute new level. And so it's the idea, and this comes from Disney's earlier kind of work out of Silly Symphonies, which were a huge success, at least small commercial success, but hugely successful to develop an individuals that were interested in funding and watching animation. So you take that, you basically look at the different manipulations that animation can have in this non-realistic, fantastical world. And of course, the most famous one is Sorcerer Mickey, which everyone knows. It's one of the most common images, the Mickey Sorcerer, how that blue and red even used to be the logo of part of the Magic Kingdom that is now Hollywood Studios. So spectacular look at the way that music and animation, music and sound can transport you into various different worlds. Little vignettes. Bicycle Thieves by Vittorio De Sica, one of the greatest movies of all time, specifically dealing with the idea of Italian neorealism, this very gritty, dingy look at pre-post World War I, all the way up through the interwar period and the aftermath of World War II, showing you the gritty underbelly of what society really looked like in the interwar period and the aftermath of World War II. Generally using non-professional actors, non-professional settings, on a handheld camera, tells the story, a very philosophical and sad story of poverty. An individual here has no money, he's offered a job, but he needs a bicycle. So he sells his sheets, the last thing that he has that he can sell, to get his bike out of hock, gets his bicycle, climbs up to actually put the posters. And the posters are all of these beautiful Hollywood women celebrating the idea of escapism. Well, Italy didn't want escapism. They wanted to deal with the harsh realities of what it meant to be Italian in the aftermath of colonialism and losing as one of the Axis powers in World War II. They were struggling. And they were financially struggling, economically struggling, socially struggling, nationally struggling. And that's what the film deals with. That bike gets stolen. The rest of the film is him trying to find that bike. At the very end, he makes a decision to steal a bike. He never found his own bike, to steal someone else's bike. And he gets caught. Not only does he get caught, his son, the little kid who thought his dad was a hero, who's been teaching morality and been wonderful, guiding the family all along, sees him steal it. And you need to figure out, now what do you tell your son? The film leaves it there. Go out to the bar, have a drink, go out to the cafe, have a coffee with your friends, and try to figure out what is the meaning of life based upon this philosophical entry. A very Italian neorealistic film. One of a few entries then of John Ford's Stagecoach. Basically, it comes down to the idea of cowboys versus Indians, which many people played and is very not PC in the modern day world. But in the 1940s, the 1950s, 1957, even when I was a kid in the early 1980s, before we started playing Star Wars battles, we used to play cowboys and Indians out in the woods. And we all knew the cowboys were the good guys and the Indians, now we refer to them as Native Americans like Geronimo, were the bad guys. We had a very clear sensibility of right versus wrong, good versus bad. And a couple of the films later on John Ford start to question this aspect, as we have some cowboys that are deeply flawed human individuals, and some Native Americans that show moral standards well beyond the cowboys. Not in this first image, but in some of his later works, such as The Searchers and other images. So we have this harrowing kind of events that start to happen. So this is the birthplace of our modern way of looking at the Old West as this rootin' tootin' cowboy shooting kind of aspect, when we know it actually was not like that at all. It's actually a pretty well run, organized, but very rural society. And so John Ford has actually created as a director the way we think about the American West. Man with a Movie Camera by Zika Vertov, one of the great early innovators of documentary film from the Russian style. And so he really wants to document urban life as you're moving from a city to city with dazzling invention. And so there's no real characters, there's no real narrative. It really is celebrating the idea of industrial life and trying to document the idea of industrial life. Now, in the same time as a documentary film, what makes this unique is that he's using all sorts of technical innovations to try to show this, which generally is reserved more for formalist or Hollywood films, including things like extreme close-ups, Dutch angles, fast motion, slow motion. So he's using all the tricks that you get are available to you, but trying to show you an individual that we're documenting all the different scenes from different angles that show up. So again, a challenge to documentary filmmaking. King Kong. King Kong is a special effects masterpiece. Even by today's standard, it holds up because it just doesn't use one special effect. It uses all the special effects and combines them, very similar to the way Avatar did for a more modern world, or Star Wars did for the 1970s. And so it takes stop motion, clay motion. It used rear screen projection for live action. They have live action that's taking place. They also have a rear screen that shows up showing images that were recorded before. And it puts it all into this seamless whole using lighting and techniques and special effects that made this a harrowing adventure right on the verge of being considered a horror film from earlier in. They also are using beautiful model making for up closes that show an emotionality that we just hadn't seen in the creatures beforehand. So a tour de force specifically of special effects. Battle of Algiers is a very interesting film. So in the 1950s, you can read here, fear and violence escalate as individuals start to fight for independence from the French government in Algiers. And so this is based upon historical events of the Algerian War, which lasted for about 6 years, from 54 to 62, against the French government. But it was shot in a very newsreel, very documentary style in black and white, even though color was readily available and the more common form for films. And so you are basically thinking that you are looking at a realistic, real life film that's happening right before you, that's challenging the idea of colonial powers, but also the idea of violence and what needs to be done in order to overthrow those violence. And so later on, when we talk about third world cinema or cinema of the oppressed, which deals with cinema that comes out of Cuba under Castro, or later on out of Brazil or out of Venezuela, that deals with third world nations that are trying to rip off the yoke of colonialism, and generally have to be shot guerrilla style with handheld cameras. They can't go into theaters because the colonial power still controls the theaters. They have to be shown on screens later on. These are all a response and a thank back to the Battle of Algiers. Ben-Hur, spectacular achievement in filmmaking. It was tied for winning the most Academy Awards of all time with 11 awards. So when we look at aesthetics, this is about as good as you can do as aesthetics in the late 1950s or even up into the early 1960s. It also was a challenge because we had to make sure that would be acceptable because we were living under the McCarthy scare area. And so we had McCarthy basically saying what could be watched and what could not be watched. And it is the slave revolt by a Jewish individual during the Roman Empire. But one thing it does do, it does show that we as the American population are willing to go sit for 3 hours for an epic historical adaptation, and we go back more than once. So it really does open the gateway for other giant historical innovations, such as Cleopatra, and things that are shortcoming in the future. Psycho, the film that challenged horror films. Originally, some of the scenes were considered so risque they were worried about rating X, so they re-edited. One of the most famous scenes in all of film history comes out of here, and of course that's the shower scene. Something like 78 shots manipulated so that you don't see any nakedness. You think you do because your mind puts it in. You don't see any violence. You just see a knife coming down, and then you see these blood ketchup droppings at the very bottom. Some beautiful dissolves, one of the best 3 minutes and 11 seconds of filmmaking. The idea this has all the features that we would expect to see in a Hitchcock film, including the beautiful blonde that's showing up, the idea that sometimes the evil that takes place happens at night, and a brilliant ending with also a dissolve between Norman Bates, because you're not sure who the killer is, potentially even the movie too. Because what you're seeing is a male body at the end that's been collected or been arrested and brought to prison, but there's a female voice running in his head. So who is it? Is it the mom or the son that's actually the killer? That's the point that you've got to figure out as you run through this. Stanley Kubrick's one of his masterpieces. He has many. The individual that is basically known as a director for being the most artsy director. Stanley Kubrick would shoot numerous times until he got exactly what he wanted, sometimes terrifying his own actors. So this is the case of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It takes him 4 years to make a film because of the perfectionism, but he basically is reinventing. People had not traveled in space. And so as the filming and the techniques are taking place, and the idea of computer-based technology, and the idea of what gravity or no gravity actually feels and looks like with pens and various things floating around, how do you make gravity with circular spinning? He's basically inventing the way we look at science fiction in the modern day world, and asking a historical question and a philosophical question. What is it at certain points in human emotion, in human imagination, that challenges us to make the leap? When we're apes, how do we develop tools? When we're out in the field or getting close to death, what are the thoughts that are coming into our heads? So he really is trying to analyze what it means to be human. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, generally considered the best of the spaghetti westerns. Spaghetti westerns based upon Akira Kurosawa's samurai films, particularly things like The Seven Samurai. And so The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly then is a superhero team that actually comes together the same way the Seven Samurai, just not with 7 of them yet. It's a spaghetti western, so it's being funded by the Italians, but it's on cowboy culture when really it's based upon samurai. Later on, Quentin Tarantino is actually going to be talking about these films, and this is generally considered the best of those spaghetti westerns. Jaws, the idea of putting an animal in horror that later on is going to lead us to Steven Spielberg. Well, this is a Steven Spielberg, but to such things as Jurassic Park. It is also the birthplace of the summer blockbuster. Here's a young kid who was actually in film school, was offered to actually create this script, create this wonderful movie, left film school, and the rest is movie making history. The most successful director of all time. This film's currently somewhere around $16 billion in ticket sales. It's just remarkable. And that doesn't even include any of the merchandise that comes along with your t-shirts from Jaws or E.T. or the rides that show up in places like Universal, Jurassic Park. So it's an amazing accomplishment, and really does the idea. One of the great things here is the leitmotif, the idea of the sound and having the shark eyes you, da 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 da, one of the most famous scores in all of music history. The birth of the summer blockbuster. Star Wars Episode 5, another one of my favorite movies of all time, The Empire Strikes Back. Basically talks about the dark aftermath. If the rebels and the good guys were really good at the beginning, and we're thinking of this now because of the success of the movies as a long-range trilogy, and with the marketing and all of the toys and all of the costumes and the lunchboxes that go out, it really creates a money-making market empire that shows up for George Lucas. The idea of the special effects, the Lucasfilm Limited, the idea of the THX kind of surround sound that develops, they're all being developed across these first 3 movies. This is all the way from 1980. Planet of the Apes, one of the great science fiction movies, specifically known for costume and makeup. There were no costume or makeup Academy Awards that had ever been given out before Planet of the Apes. So the director, actually at the very end, Schaffner, literally worked with individuals within the Academy to create the idea of makeup and costume. And the first costume or makeup award that ever went from the Academy Awards went in retrospect to this particular individual from Planet of the Apes. It was so remarkable and so amazing that the horses got confused and would not even let the apes on them. They had to be retrained. So spectacular. It also deals with the idea of race relations. We are in the 1960s, one of the most tumultuous time in American history. And here we have individuals then that are apes, a very negative depiction or a very negative way of referring to African Americans, monkeys and apes it's just a racist connotation that are not fully developed on the evolutionary scale. So this is saying, what happens if we take these apes and we gave them the same power and technology, the ability to read, write, reason, have dinner parties, and we actually had them with that kind of power? Would they exact the same vengeance and the same abuse on white people as white people did during the slave period, during that time period? So a spectacular look at that. Hey, what you doing? Look done. Okay. All right, continuing on. So we move to 32. We're up to another Stanley Kubrick. Far before his year, and you'll note there are 4 years in between his movies, but a lot of his movies appear because they're about the best in terms of movie making, in terms of aesthetics we have. Many of them are not commercially successful during their own days, but they set the standards for what other filmmakers want to do. And this Challenges was one of the most brilliant opening shots in film industry. So rather than starting off with the establishing shot and then a full shot, you start with an extreme close-up of a serial killer staring right at you, who does not blink for a number of minutes. And you slowly zoom out and you see the blood and everything that happens, that he's at a bar trying to get psyched up with basically hallucinogenic milk, that he's going to go out and then commit the old ultra violence. Later on this film, he's going to try to be convinced out of that ultra violence, talking about where we are today. Can we really do CBT, cognitive behavioral training therapy, to get people to not be serial killers, to not be violent? Or is it part of our animal human instinct on the inside? So problematic because of the images of rape that show up within this. It was rated X and actually outlawed in many countries around the world for fear of what people might do after watching it. The Searchers. Here we go with another John Ford. This is most likely John Ford's masterpiece, and ends with, many of you know, John Wayne looking out, walking away in a black body, or a black kind of screened outline of an open window into the beautiful monument valley of the ancient West that shows up. It basically is the story then of an American Civil War veteran who's already known violence. He embarks on a journey to rescue his niece from the Comanches, who he's afraid that she will be gang raped within the process. And so at the very end, he wants to defile the Native Americans so that he can kill as many as he possibly can. So we see the kind of violence that shows up on both sides of the attack. Gone with the Wind, sometimes considered the most romantic kind of film of all times. It's a spectacular achievement showing really the South during the Civil War, before, during, and after, within the kind of the Reconstructionist period, and the lives of the people that actually lived mostly at the top. Also known because we had a starring role for an African American, Hattie McDaniel, who became the first person to ever win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress by an African American in either the male or female category. This is also, even when we adjust inflation for today, still the highest grossing film of all time is Gone with the Wind. Un Chien Andalou, not necessarily the most controversial, but clearly the weirdest film. This is a surrealist film, so this is all the way in the realm, getting very close to avant-garde or true formalism, where there is not a narrative structure. There are images that you have to interpret from your own subconscious and from what you know, so very audience participatory. It runs for about 17 minutes through this dream world of violence, of sexuality, of not knowing where you are, of repeating characters, and then trying to figure it out all on your own. Audiences fell in love with this in France and went back to it a number of times that shows up. And so it is not a chronological story, it's really a reflection of what's going on in your mind. The first time, Saving Private Ryan. This film is the most realistic depiction of war that we have ever seen. So it came out in 1998. It's about 20 years old now and still holds up. It basically introduces us to the idea of the D-Day invasion and what it actually felt like. So realistic were the images that people who had actually experienced D-Day went in and actually had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, reflections and problems and getting sick and really reawakening things that they had just forgotten. It put them back in that mindset because of the frenetic pace. The opening 28 minutes are generally considered some of the best 28 minutes that you have ever seen or will ever see on film, almost as a perfect medium, where Steven Spielberg combines not just the great acting, but the idea of the overall setup, the Dutch angles, the slow motion, the etherealized, every new scene basically introduces you to another aspect of war is hell. And you see at the end of that 20 minutes the impact that it has on 18, 19, and 20-year-old kids. Sometimes some of them, this is the first time that they were ever in combat. So it's a harrowing journey into what war, World War II, specifically D-Day, looked like. The sacrifices of many. Some Like It Hot, 1959, considered one of the best comedy movies of all time. We have the director's Billy Wilder, who's one of our great comedy directors of all time, and stars Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon, and Marilyn Monroe. And it has to do with the idea of cross-dressing. And so this idea of the person dressed in drag, so it was actually produced without a lot of studio support or publication because it basically is a gangster who witnesses something of St. Valentine's Day massacre that needs to get away. And the only way they can do it is act by cross-dressing. And so it's a fantastic look. It's one of the films that actually made Marilyn Monroe a star. Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis were always stars. So it generally comes in as one of the best comedy movies of all time. Annie Hall. Annie Hall is the last comedy film to win an Academy Award for Best Picture. That was all the way back in 1977. It's by Woody Allen. It basically is considered Woody Allen's best work that shows up, and he was part of the editing crew as well. One of the things that makes it really remarkable is in the aftermath of creating the film, Woody Allen was looking at the footage in which he was supposed to be the star and realized that he was not the one dominating the scene. It was actually his partner here, Diane Keaton. And so it was re-edited to actually show and based upon Annie Hall rather than his character as well. And it does reintroduce you to a couple characters, specifically the life of living in neurotic New York during the 1970s and 1980s and the craziness of city life in a modern day life for single individuals. Night of the Living Dead. When we go back and look at this, George Romero, this is the idea of a different type of horror film. We have the zombie horror film that comes up that deals with what do we do if there's this natural disaster that takes place? And in this particular case, note the date again, 1968. We're going through the civil rights movement. One of the most amazing things that shows up from this is that in that 1968 kind of capacity, a major issue is that we were dealing with race relations. And so this film, the hero is a black male, which we had never really seen before in the history of Western cinema, or at least in American cinema. And so that raised some issues. This film was rated X as well, because there's a brief cannibalistic scene. And it's ironic because today, at worst, this would be PG, but probably PG to PG-13, even in the modern day world. 1968, those things were so controversial, it was rated X and terrifying. Later on, George Romero is going to redo that. It's going to put a woman in the 1980s as the heroine, the person who saves them all. Another Steven Spielberg, arguably one of the greatest family films of all time. At one time, this film was the film that had raised more money than any other film in film history. And of course, Steven Spielberg is going to knock himself out about 10 years later when he makes Jurassic Park. It is a family kind of adventure, fulfilling, and it really does set the role. If we do think of Steven Spielberg as an auteur, here's one of the films we've got to consider in terms of the family values that show up, the idea of the childlike wonder, Steven Spielberg's all face. E.T. Phone Home, the impact it has. Skittles was originally offered the role for the potential aspect of having the candy here. They refused, and they are very sad they did. So instead, they use peanut M&M, and the stock of Hershey's went up remarkably. The Matrix from 1991, taking Chinese martial arts, specifically by people like Yuan Ping, the most famous martial arts choreographer of all time, still living today. So making films largely with Quentin Tarantino and actually putting them in a Western audience. This is a highly philosophical action film. And so the Wachowski brothers here, Lily, Alana, they actually took the individuals and they took a philosophy course. They were trying to explain the concepts between what is real and what is not real. Basically, the basis between Aristotle and Plato on a very foundational level between Morpheus and Neo. And kind of what is real? Is real based upon the senses? Is real electrical impulses? How you know what's living is real? It's a real philosophical. Almost everyone knows the various ideas in terms of the bending over backwards in slow motion that shows up during the bullet scene. So one of the most famous films, spoofed constantly. An enormous impact, our next film, as they all do. It's the top 100. Toy Story, director John Lasseter. Potentially he is one of the top 25 directors we have not talked about, though he's got a number of issues that have shown up with sexual harassment in recent years. And so one of the things that shows up with Toy Story, it's our first fully CGI film and introduces us into a magical world where we actually do feel realistic aspects of toys and of animation process where we never have felt that realistic aspect before. We've been able to, before CGI, computer-generated imagery, and computer-generated animation, we felt like the characters have been involved emotionally, but now we really have a realistic sense. So it introduces us to all sorts of characters that we still love today. Pulp Fiction, likely Quentin Tarantino's early masterpiece from 1994. Many people put this on their top 10 list of their favorite films of all time because of the combination it has. It's basically taking the new kind of drive that shows up from the French New Wave from the 1950s and 60s. It takes the Westerner impact that shows up and puts all that together then with the images of kind of Kurosawa and earlier classical film director. He really is one of the great students of film history and constantly playing with the idea of Western modalities, violence that shows up, violence for violence sake, uses the chapter heading, so uses a lot of earlier features. And generally considered one of those great masterpieces as it deals with particularly things such as the dance scene, the gangster movie, the Western movie, putting them all together in a very postmodern world. Number 45, generally considered the best movie that's ever been made on race relations. This is Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee, who finally and most deservedly received an Academy Award very recently after 30 years of filmmaking. It basically deals with the idea of what happens on a hot day in Bed-Stuy, Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn when things go wrong. Do we interpret everything that we see within racial terms? And this is very apparent for the modern day world. If something happens when a white police officer attacks a black man or a black woman, is it automatically racial? Is it automatically racist? Is it automatically that we need to wait for the facts to come out? Or has there been such a historical cultural legacy that we can read things into it and behind it because it's another example of what happens to be there? So who's in the right? Who's in the wrong? I don't know. Watch the film. It asks, do the right thing. And the last scene leaves you completely questioning, what is the right thing? What is the right thing to do? And that's what's being caused here. Going to our third Stanley Kubrick. I said, he is the master of the art film. He's done it with science fiction already. Now we're actually going to see it in the horror genre. This film is often considered one of the best, if not the best, horror films of all time. It's nearly perfect in terms of looking at psychological intensity of a man in isolation, slowly descending into madness. So much so, the madness is not on himself and not haunted by ghosts. The madness is that he's about, or potentially about, to harm his own family, including his lovely, wife who's isolated, can't protect herself, but specifically also his son. within the process, who has the shine so he can actually see things. If you have not seen this film and you are a fan of horror, or if you have not seen this film and a fan of film, I highly recommend, because the editing is superlative in terms of building up suspense and the beautiful use of music. Later on, Sid's carpet in his room is going to be based upon the carpet here for a direct correlation and paying homage to the different influences that show up. Fantastic movie, highly recommend, particularly around the horror time. Gojira, Godzilla, the Japanese version, later on going to be the American version of Godzilla. What do we do in the aftermath of a nuclear holocaust? In the aftermath of World War II, we do not know what the long-term impact is going to be of various nuclear fallout and lessons that are going to show up. And so this is one of those where we're actually trying to learn those lessons as we're moving forward. What do you do? What happens with the monsters? Do we produce other monsters? Are there other monsters that have this nuclear waste? And so initially a destructive force comes back to save Japan from others. So it's a protective force basically that has been created within the travesty. So trying to make, lemonade out of lemons in terms of something that's awful and that has happened within our society. Oh, God. Spirit Away, arguably Hayao Miyazaki's most famous work, and likely maybe his best work, though that is debatable with such a career for what he's been able to do. The establishment of Japanese animation, so much that it was introduced to the United States, and this one was sponsored by Quentin Tarantino in terms of the original dubbed version. It basically takes the idea of animation and puts it in an adult framework where there may not be a good, there may not be a bad, there is actually characters of both. So morality here is not easily understood in any way. Beautifully shot, beautifully laid out. One of the only directors actually in the world that's also working with visual imagery first and then making the narrative, making what he actually wants to say about it come out of that work. So he basically, his storyboards are not finished almost until the very end. He uses weather elements coming out of Kurosawa, who's another Japanese classical artist we've already seen from the Seven Samurai. We'll see his film Rashomon coming up in a couple slots as well. But one of the best animated features of all time, illustrating why Miyazaki is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. Number 49, The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola. The idea of the acting here is about as good as acting as you'll ever see. If you look at the stars beneath us, Marlon Brando, multiple Academy Award winners, Al Pacino, one of the greatest method actors ever, James Caan, and Diane Keaton, remember, who already has an Academy Award from, or will get another Academy Award after this, for Annie Hall, the film that we saw actually done for the birth of comedy, the last comedy film in 1977, ever to win an Academy Award. It basically tells the tale of the mafia and has two of the most important scenes in the history of film. One is the baptism gunfight scene, which we've seen a couple different times when we talk about montage theory, the idea of contrast editing between someone taking over the fatherhood role and becoming the godfather of this child that they're going to protect in Christian values, and having his enemies murdered at the exact same time. And so contrast editing showing up there. The film was shot in very low key and so dark, in fact, that when it was made for video and DVD, they had to lighten the colors up a little bit in order that it would actually showcase within the prospect. But fantastic film. If this is not generally considered the #1 film of all time, it goes back and forth between this and Citizen Kane. So really setting up the gangster film. And then finally, at least for our first round, Alien from 1979. The birth of what we call science fiction and horror, the two blending together, is done by Ridley Scott. And in 1979, we are looking at new heroines and new heroes, kind of like what we did in the 1960s. We've just gone through, or in the process of going through, the second wave of feminism within this process. And so the heroine here is actually going to be a woman. And we do use her body sometimes in sexual components, but it really is more about her power and her ability to control that allows her to defeat at least an alien before aliens come back the second time. Because of course, when a film is successful now, we're absolutely going to have a sequel that shows up. So a fantastic film showing horror genre, one of the most famous scenes in all of cinema history, where we have a lovely alien make an emergence out of someone's body that no one in the audience was prepared for, and freak the heck out even of the actors who weren't sure what was taking place during the time period. And so that's what we're looking at. Those are our first 50, with 50 left to go, at least for this first section. Tune in the future, and we will have a lovely day. Bye.